So Jacob's not doing very good in developing his convictions. He's yelling at Laban. He's yelling at Laban. He's angry. This is called the holy anger movement, not the holy laughter movement. And no one laughed. But he thinks God is also on his side, because what does he say in verse 42? He says, basically, if God hadn't been with me and more of my great spirituality and was for me, then you would have probably stolen everything from me and I would have gone home broke. You see, Laban doesn't quite buy what Jacob is selling. See, Laban knows that there's something about Jacob that is not to be trusted. That Laban really should have, he thought he had him with the gods. That Jacob had finally stepped over the line and he would get him, but he couldn't quite get him. Jacob says, if you look at verse 42, he says, if it wasn't for God who saw my affliction, and then he says something really strange, and the labor of my hands. In other words, God rewarded me because of my works of my hands. I think he has a misunderstanding of why God blesses. Again, he's thinking that he's fulfilling the law, and his heart is not in it, and his heart is not committed to it. And just like the Pharisees, he said, your lips may be with me, but your heart is what? Far from me. You understand that obeying the law is a heart issue at first. In San Antonio, I remember visiting a couple. They said, we don't like to go to church because every time we go to church, they ask for money. I said, I very, very rarely preach on money. I say, it really is from your heart. This was a couple, they weren't believers. They were given to me to go visit, and I went to visit them, and for, I think, about 9 months I didn't see them. One Sunday they came. Guess what I was preaching on? Money! I was! And I was preaching on why God desires and likes a cheerful and a hilarious giver. Well, they got mad and they laughed. We start building our convictions not with just knowing what to do, but having a heart that desires to do what God says. See, you can obey the law, but you can be unpleasing to God. And the final thing we see here, not only do we build our convictions by making sure they're pleasing to God, that they're based on the character of God, and also they're based on being humble about our ability to obey them. But finally, if we're going to build Christian convictions, don't trust your own spirituality. It's kind of the third thing said again. Don't trust your own righteousness in keeping them. You see, all of a sudden now, Laban enters into a covenant or an agreement with Jacob. Because Jacob is using God as a self-defense mechanism. God is on my side, he's not on your side, so nah. You ever know Christians who compare themselves all the time and they think they're spiritually superior to other Christians? It creates a legalism in their own mind and heart because their focus is on keeping the law and their heart is not into keeping that law. They trust in their own works and their own performance than they do their own love for God. Because all the law is an expression of our love for God. The Bible says in 1 John, if we love Him, His commandments are not what? Burdensome. God's commandments are not burdensome for one who loves Him. If you love God, you'll be happy to keep His commandments. You'll be happy to do what He wants you to do. You'll be happy to wait on Him and trust Him and love Him, and you'll do that in a joyful way. God doesn't want Christians who mope around and say, I just am doing this because I have to. It's the same way with any relationship. You do things because you love to do them. Does God intervene in our life more because we're spiritually great or because we are sinners in need of grace? I would say the second one, wouldn't you? The reason why God intervenes in Jacob's life is not because Jacob is a morally superior man than Laban. It's because God has set His affections upon Laban and chosen to show His affection on Jacob and shown His mercy to Jacob. But what do? Laban does not trust Jacob, so what he has to do, he doesn't trust what Jacob is going to say, so he has to build a covenant. So they build a pillar, or they get a pillar, and they get a bunch of rocks, and they put them as a monument around there, and there's a covenant that is going to be made. And the covenant really says, hey, Jacob, this is what I want you to do. You cannot marry any other women than the daughters that you have married so far. And then if you come ever back this way, or I ever go this way, beyond these rocks and these pillars and this monument, we will never do each other any harm. And God is my witness. You're going to claim God is on your side? I'm going to say now you are bound to God that if you do me harm, God will be after you too. You see, if Laban didn't trust Jacob, he might have tried to do the things in the letter of the law, but his heart was deceptive. And in building our convictions, we have to have both head and heart involved in all of it. Head, heart, and feet, I would say. Because all that we do shouldn't be like Jacob. We shouldn't encroach on each other's rights, or do what is right by people and do what is right by God. We shouldn't encroach on that, because when we encroach on those things, and we become out of bounds for God. And Jacob had no system of ethics. He had no system of ethics beyond that which he thought was right on the outside. I've done everything I could, but I'm not at fault. You can't accuse me. I'm not at fault. The Jews at Jesus' day, what did they say to Jesus? We are of our father Abraham. And we've never, we're not children of anybody else. And what did Jesus call those Jews in John chapter 8? You are of what? Your father, the devil. Because if you knew the deeds, if you see the deeds that I do, and you don't recognize me, you are not really of your father Abraham. Because to be of the father Abraham, it was by faith and not by lineage. The Sermon on the Mount is the same way. It shows that if we're building our convictions, we're building them not just on the outward appearance of our lives, but on the inward morality and the inward motivation of our hearts. I said at the beginning, legalism is any time that you make your personal convictions normative for everybody else to follow. But it is also, if you are just going to minimize the motive of God, the motive of it, just to follow the law and not to have a right heart for it, that's another form of legalism that finds the lowest common denominator in just getting by with outward appearances. You see, tonight as we looked at Jacob, Jacob is the antitype to Rudy. Jacob doesn't obey God from his heart. Rudy, in the story, worked and worked and worked until he was told that he would not suit for the last game of the season. And the story goes, the whole team comes in to Coach Divine's office, and they start laying their jerseys. If you remember the scene, they start laying the jerseys down on the coach's table, saying, "I'll give my spot up for Rudy. I'll give my spot up for Rudy. I'll give my spot up for Rudy. I'll give my spot up for Rudy." And unknown to Rudy, as all this was going on, he decides at the moment to quit, but his friend encouraged him to go back because he had the convictions to do what is right, because he ultimately loved Notre Dame football. It wasn't because he had to. His friend, the only reason why his friend was still playing Notre Dame football is because his dad wouldn't pay for his schooling if he didn't play. That's like Jacob. He was just going through the motions, looking right. And we can go through the motions as a Christian, but Rudy eventually got on the field for 2 plays, I guess it said in the movies, a kickoff at the end of the game, and he made a tackle at the end of the game and was carried off. They said, I think there's some question about whether he was carried off or not. I don't know. I was hearing that on a radio station a while ago. But the whole attitude, and I equate Rudy as someone who's doing what is right with a whole heart. Jacob wasn't doing that. So as you develop your convictions, do it with your heart, not just with your deeds. Would you pray with me?